because you're still taking it upon yourself. You're taking the law into your own hands. You're betraying your country, the organizations you work for, even your family. Yeah, and you have to give credit to some of these people, no matter what your views are of them, personality-wise, and the things that they did. They were convicted of their belief and thought, well, they're going to risk everything for it. But when they asked about the actual consequences for individuals who were compromised by them, they sort of downplay it and say, oh, well, nobody died because of what I did. But in reality, agents were compromised, they were rounded up, and generally they found themselves at the bottom of a basement with a bullet in the brain. I don't recall specifically who compromised that particular operation, but sadly for him, it ended up with him biting down on a cyanide capsule.
Welcome to Too Complicated for History. My name is Isaac S. Loftus, and I am joined by my co-host, Dr. Lynn Robbins.
Hey, everyone.
We come to you twice a month to bring you the history that has fallen through the cracks of your curriculum. And today we have a particularly special episode. Longtime listeners of the channel and the podcast would know that we spend most of our time in early American history, when spying was generally frowned upon. There were very few official spy programs. Espionage was something that ungentlemanly people did. However, today, we're bringing on an expert in that very thing.
Yes, we're very happy to welcome Philip Thompson, who is the creator of the Philip Thompson YouTube channel, and it features true life spy stories. Thanks so much for being here with us today, Philip.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Isaac. Very excited to be speaking to you today.
Yeah, so I found you on YouTube, and I think you did a really, really great job on your channel bringing these spy stories to life, and they're mostly from the 20th century. But like I said, in early American history, it wasn't really a thing. There was very few official espionage programs, but you wanted to talk about, or we brought up a little bit about like how we were going to shape this discussion, because your videos cover a broad range of people and subjects and times.
Sure.
But you had brought up the potentiality of talking about the concept of MICE, M-I-C-E.
Yes, and which is an acronym, which I'll get to. Before I reveal what it stands for, I think it's worth just saying that sort of I started my channel just as having a general interest in historical topics. I happened to cover a spy story, which I saw a gap that hadn't really seen any documentaries on a particular spy, Oleg Gordievsky. Turned that into a video, saw some success, and as any half-sensible YouTube enthusiast would do, you sort of follow that niche. And I love a good spy story just as much as the next person. So I was very happy to then pursue that niche, which I've done for about the last 2 years. And you're right, I cover spy stories principally from the 20th century, touching into the 21st, sometimes going a bit further back in time, but particular interest is around World War II and the Cold War, and those are the majority of the stories that I've covered. And as I sort of got deeper into these different stories, one of the most interesting things, to me at least, was the psychology behind it, and that's where this whole idea of MICE comes from. So the acronym stands for money, ideology, coercion, or compromise, and ego. And this is essentially a framework that has been devised which conveys the four principles or principal motivations as to why people become a spy. They betray whether it's their country, their organization, typically, especially in the 20th century, that was betraying national interests. And it's a fascinating look into the mind of spies. And what I've noticed, any kind of spy story is going to be quite divisive in terms of people that are for or against the particular person, because one man's a traitor is another man's hero. So I've always, so I'm, the stories that I cover are chiefly involving Great Britain, the US. I live in the UK, but I'm originally from South Africa. And I've sort of have to recognize that even though I come from Africa, I have these presuppositions and a lens through which I view these stories, and have to try and understand, okay, well, this person that I think is an absolute rotter to somebody on the other side of the table is actually their hero. So thinking of it in that sense and seeing what motivates people to do different things. And a lot of the spies that I cover, they are just scumbags, and they were motivated for scumbag reasons. And then there's other instances where the person has a more nuanced reason of factors, and the whole thing with M.I.C.E, again, so money, ideology, coercion, or compromise and ego, which we'll go through, I'm sure. It's very seldom that it's just one of those things that is the only motivating factor. There's always going to be an interplay between at least two, if not more, of those. And that's for me where it really gets interesting, is seeing where those cross over, and also how those motivations have developed over time. And you'll see that at certain points in history, there's one particular factor for political and socio-economic reasons, which might be the predominant factor, and that sort of changes and develops over time, which I find quite fascinating.
This episode of Too Complicated for History is brought to you by our supporters over on Patreon. If you'd like to support the show and join the conversation, our membership is completely free. And that gives you access to our Discord, which is a place for like-minded history fans and even some of the historians that we've interviewed to just chat, hang out, and ask interesting questions. Our paid tiers give you access to exclusive content, live streams, and even signed book giveaways. Check it out today at patreon.com/primarysourcemedia. That's patreon.com/primarysourcemedia. Pat should put it in a graphic right about here. Now let's get back to the show.
So as an early Americanist, if you're talking about all of this, and the person I'm thinking of course, is Benedict Arnold.
Yes.
And he was a general. He worked with George Washington, and then he flopped and went over to work for the British. But he was a general. He was a high-ranking official. So as we go on and we're talking about these spies, do people who become spies generally already start as high-ranking officials, or are any of them just people off the street? Where do these spies tend to come from? Are they already in sort of government high up spaces, or are there ones who are just kind of like us, normal folks, who end up in these international intrigue?
Well, it's essentially anybody who has access to information, and
okay.
so that is typically that would be somebody who is high up in some sort of organization or government agency, of course. But it could be people that are outside the formal structures of intelligence agencies or government organizations. They may move in the right social circles, be connected to the right people. A lot of the information or secret information that people don't want to get spilled out gets exchanged at parties, privately, pillow talk type stuff. So it really could be anybody. But I think what I've seen in the stories that I've covered, it's generally the people who have the access are those working in intelligence agencies. And since the sort of Benedict Arnold days, the formal structures of intelligence have developed. So naturally, people will come out of those organizations, and it's easy pickings for somebody who has before computers, a filing desk that just has tons of secret information. They can slip that to their briefcase, take it home, copy it, and send it off to the other side and receive a fat paycheck for it.
That's interesting, because since you said that there's people that typically have, are in positions of access or power, that financial interests are like a main component. Because I would imagine if you're in that position, you're probably not living paycheck to paycheck. It's not the janitor at the building that is the one that's being contacted for this kind of stuff.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. Although, adjusting for inflation in some of the cases I've covered, these people were certainly earning a very respectable upper middle class income for whatever time period they're living in. But I think people who are working in those sorts of high stress environments, there's a lot that is demanded of them, particularly psychologically. If they're not being put in physical danger, it's a psychological burden. And perhaps there's an argument to be made that the compensation is not sufficient.
Sure.
I look at the same as teachers. Everybody always says, and I agree with, teachers don't get paid enough for the huge responsibility that they take on. And so I think that people who do work in the intelligence game must do so out of a calling rather than any ambition to get rich.
Right.
Yeah, and one of the interesting aspects of M.I.C.E and the acronym is in the 80s there was a CIA study that was done, and it was called Project Slammer, because they were interviewing people who'd been busted for spying and were sitting behind bars. And they developed that M.I.C.E framework a little bit further, looking at what these motivations were. And they came up with sort of 4 key findings that said that most people who turn to espionage, that experience some kind of life-changing event or major stress. This could be financial troubles, of course, going through a divorce or extreme job dissatisfaction. Many of them also felt underappreciated in their roles. So that could be because they felt underpaid. A lot of them also would feel that they're the smartest person in the room. They didn't get the promotion they wanted. And for that reason, felt like by acting out as a spy, they were sort of showing their superiors who was boss and that they actually are really smart. And some of the common personality types that emerged from Project Slammer were that typically, and of course speaking very generally here, the people who commit espionage generally are manipulative. They could have antisocial tendencies or be easily influenced by others. And of course, this is like looking from the framework of someone who's investigating why people have betrayed them. So these are all very negative aspects to personalities. Whereas when you get to the question of ideology, which we will in a little bit, you'll see that a lot of spies did so out of extreme ideological conviction. Money wasn't a factor for them, and they believed in some sort of greater good, and that what they were doing, whether rightly or wrongly, was something that their conscience required them to do. So that's how it gets so interesting, because there's more than 2 sides to the coin, and trying to understand why somebody did something, and also trying to understand it in the historical context, I think is really important to get into the minds of these people.
For sure.
Absolutely. So I think what's interesting that you said about this project is that they're looking at the people who spied, I guess if it's, the individual is looking at people who spied against his country. So do the ones who are looking for spies for their country see these same attributes as negative? I don't know if this makes sense, but it's like, if Benedict Arnold is on your side, you're thinking, oh, this guy,
Absolute
you're
hero.
trying to exploit these negative aspects of them, or do you think they're a little more positive, or just like, we want these negative aspects, but they're gonna work for us, kind of thing?
Yeah, well, it's a tricky one. So, for example, in the Cold War, the US and British spies who went and spied for the Soviet Union, a lot of them did have these sorts of negative attributes, and perhaps they were taken advantage of. But in the Soviet Union, they were regarded as heroes. They had their faces put on postage stamps, and they were awarded pensions by the KGB and lived as comfortably as you could behind the Iron Curtain. And the same thing happened with defectors from the Soviet Union to the US or to the West. So, everybody has their own vices. And I think those get highlighted when the spying aspect is revealed to the world, and everybody, depending where you're sitting from, you take a view on how you think of that particular person.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's some, just even thinking of a modern context, this isn't one-to-one because I don't don't necessarily think that they are involved in espionage, but I do. There's some folks that have defected from North Korea that, as they're very highly regarded in the U.S. as far as like giving their opinion. They're giving a platform to then speak out and sort of promote why they did it. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and
Right.
if we look at the ideology is what really fascinates me. But so the money thing, of course, it's obvious. Everybody can be tempted by a huge amount of money that's dangled in front of you. And you've got the notable US spies, Aldrich Ames, probably the most notorious, the CIA counterintelligence officer, one of the worst moles in US intelligence history.
That was the first one of your videos, actually, that I watched.
Yeah. And
It's a good one.
thanks. I do need to rework it, though, because that was one of my earlier ones, and I think it needs a retelling. But yeah, in any event, I mean, he worked for the CIA for 30 years, and I think everybody on whichever side of the coin you find yourself on will acknowledge that he did what he did chiefly for money. He had a second wife whom he couldn't afford. She collected unreasonable numbers of pantyhose and handbags for some reason, and he did it for the money. And I think he collected about $4.5 million US over the period that he spied. So there's cases like him, or like John Walker of the John Walker spy ring. Walker, of course, working for the US Navy, and again delivering secrets to the Soviets in the Cold War. And there were also elements of ego, but chiefly it was money for them. Whereas the second letter in the acronym, ideology, is so interesting to see how that developed, particularly from the end of the Second World War into the Cold War and beyond. So the emergence of the ideological battleground in the lead up to World War II, as you saw the rise of fascism and Battle of Hitler and the Nazi Party in Germany, you had all these competing worldviews. So you had the capitalist democracies, you had the fascism in Europe, and then you had communism coming up in the East. And people had to pick a side, and the lines weren't as firmly drawn as they would come to be later on in the Cold War. So in the US, in Great Britain, the idea of a communist state was seen as a viable alternative to the capitalist Western democracy system, because they were looking for a way to combat fascism. So the whole idea is, well, how do we stop the fascists? How do we stop the Nazis? Because they're the real enemy. And of course, you had the US and the Western allies and the Soviet Union having an uneasy truce to ultimately defeat the Germans, but then things clearly fell apart after that.
Yeah, and it's such an interesting point that you if you lived through that period, you would look at like, hey, fascism came out of the liberal democracies. Like, they're inherently weak because they couldn't avoid this big,
Precisely.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting way to think about it, because it's not a frame of reference that I had thought about before.
Yeah, and when you look at it from our point in history, and it seems so obvious, like, well, why would those people have spied for the Soviets?
Yeah.
But they hadn't seen the practical outworkings of communism. So you had the Great Depression, and the people in America and England saw how the Western governments had failed to avoid the Second World War. They'd followed their policy of appeasing Hitler. That clearly didn't work, and many of them saw Stalin and the Soviet Union as the sort of last bulwark against the fascists. And a lot of those spies were motivated by ideology, and that's people that formed the Cambridge Five spy ring. That's a very complicated bunch of men in that group having different motivations, but people like Anthony Blunt, it's one of the stories I covered recently on my channel. And yeah, I mean, he spied for about 2 decades, and he pretty much got away with it. Not having to serve any prison time, was granted immunity because he had some dirt on the royal family. But you can in some senses understand why in the 1930s and 1940s why he could have been a communist, thinking that that was the right thing to do. But irrespective of whether somebody was ideologically justified, I still don't believe that they went about it in the right way.
Right.
Because you're still taking it upon yourself. You're taking the law into your own hands. You're betraying your country, the organizations you work for, even your family, thinking that you sort of wield enough power to change world events single-handedly. So yeah, that's why there's always things like ego that are in the mix, even if they're not doing it for money.
Yeah, if there's still a little bit of that earlier framework, like the way people thought about espionage in the 16th, 17th, 18th century was, or the 18th and 19th century really, it was it wasn't ungentlemanly. Only bad people did this, and that's kind of still true, right? You have to be at least somewhat duplicitous, and you are a liar.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah.
And that thinking carried through into the modern era. I mean, J. Edgar Hoover couldn't stand spies and spying. So he didn't want to have anything to do with it. And there's always these negative connotations. But it's just, there's no way to escape it, because if you have access to somebody who can give you information, everybody's going to get their hands dirty in that game when they realize what they can get out of it. But on the ideology, and you saw in the early stages, in the lead up to the World War II, and then the early stages of the Cold War, it was a lot of Western spies who were defecting to the Soviets. Whereas as time wore on, the reality of Stalinism became clear, and how that wasn't such a great system for various reasons. You started to see things swing the other way, where it was then the Soviets who were chiefly defecting to the West for ideological reasons. So that would include people like Oleg Gordievsky, who I mentioned earlier as one of the first spies that I covered, high-ranking KGB officer, and starts working for British intelligence in the mid-70s because he became severely disillusioned with the Soviet system, seeing the things like the suppression of the Prague Spring in the late 60s, there being no freedom of the press, and then also there being very restricted travel for people living in the Soviet Union. People in his position, working in intelligence, would be posted to other countries and their embassies, and he would experience the Western lifestyle. And I think he, much later, after he had defected to the West and was living in the UK, he described the Soviet Union as a sterile concentration camp. And so he saw what the difference was in the standard of living for the average person, saw the quashing of personal freedoms, and just living under this totalitarian regime, and decided, okay, my ideology is not that one anymore. I want to jump ship. And same thing for somebody like Oleg Penkovsky, a lot of Olegs out there. He was a GRU colonel, so in the military branch of the Soviet intelligence agency, and he probably did it a bit for money and also had a bit of an ego issue, but he had strong ideological motivations for jumping ship. I mean, he's been described as the spy who saved the world because he played a key role during the Cuban Missile Crisis and providing the Kennedy administration with key information about the location of the missile sites being built in Cuba. But yeah, and that's where it got to in the sort of height of the Cold War, until the fall of the Soviet Union. And now I think the question of ideology gets even more complicated, because I don't know really where we sit anymore in terms of national ideologies.
Right.
Yeah. Not as clear.
Not as clear, and countries themselves seem to be more divided internally than ever before. So there's, especially in the US, there's two camps, broadly speaking, and it almost feels like those two camps are at war internally more than anything else. But that's a side note.
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting. That ideologically speaking, it was probably easier when when the lines were nice and flat, when it was nice and black.
Absolutely.
And white. Like, this is how we view the world. This is how they view the world.
Yes.
Right.
And that's that.
Although back then, we look at it with the benefit of hindsight, of course. So to the people living it probably wasn't black and white to them.
Actually, that's true.
Or perhaps
That's
it was.
true.
I don't know.
Before we move on from ideology, I wanted to just, because you had highlighted in your notes that you sent over to us, the Rosenbergs.
Yes.
And I'm
Yeah.
just curious, because I haven't watched a video on the Rosenbergs, but I know who they are.
Mm.
As far as like, as far as how their framework or how they were seeing this, because they have a pretty significant
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
impact.
significant impacts on American and world history. And so Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, known as the Atomic Spies, they sold secrets to the Soviet Union after the end of the Second World War, which rapidly advanced the Soviet atomic program. And there's a lot of controversy around how the whole case was handled. I think it's generally accepted that Julius Rosenberg was an active spy, whereas his wife Ethel, there's still a bit of an open question as to the role that she played in the espionage. She certainly typed up notes of secret information that was then passed on, but the extent to which her role went beyond that, I think remains somewhat of an open question. And there were other characters involved. Greenglass, David Greenglass, I forget his first name, but it was a relative of Ethel Rosenberg who really threw her under the bus when the whole thing came to light. And of course, they were executed for their crimes, which, if I recall correctly, they were the first or the only American citizens to be to receive the death sentence or death penalty for crimes of treason or spying in peacetime. So yeah, significant characters in the whole world of espionage. They certainly had some kind of ideological conviction. Certainly Julius, being a communist and actively working for them. So yeah, certainly a significant period in the spying history.
So for Julius, it was a matter of just worldview. Like he was a believer in the communist system. Is that sort of like the accepted sort of rationale?
Yes, chiefly. There could have been other things at play.
Right.
I don't recall offhand whether he was receiving any, what sort of payments he was receiving. It could have been an ego question as well. But I think primarily it was an ideological question for him. And again, it was at a time when the realities of Soviet communism hadn't really been exposed to the world at large.
Yeah, I think you're right in terms of that. This being the most fascinating of the aspects of mice, in that without the other things motivating someone, like what do you have to believe? How strongly do you have to believe something to do something this drastic? It's an interesting.
How much
question.
do you need money? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like
It's all,
money
what are
is
you
an
willing
easy
to give
thing,
up?
Like ego is
Yeah.
a thing that feels like a personal
Right.
thing, but like believing in something larger than yourself to the point where you're going to then,
Risk your life. Yeah.
If that is the primary motivating factor for someone, that's a really interesting thing to explore.
Yeah, and you have to give credit to some of these people, no matter what your views are of them, personality-wise, and the things that they did. Yeah, they were convicted of their belief and thought, well, they're going to risk everything for it.
Yeah.
Another example being George Blake, another British spy that I have covered on my channel. And he was in the sort of same league as the Cambridge Five in that same sort of time period. And yeah, he had this ideological conviction that the Soviet Union was the only viable way to structure a country and an economy, and went for it. And he spent time in Korea and North Korea during the Korean War, found himself in a concentration camp, well, a prisoner of war camp, I should say. And there's questions as to whether he was brainwashed or if he genuinely took on a belief in communism. But either way, he came out of that prison camp a recruit for the Soviets. And he didn't, as far as I'm aware, I don't know the extent to which he received money, but that certainly wasn't a factor for him. And when he is ultimately discovered. I mean, fascinating tale. Gets sent to Wormwood Scrubs prison, receives a 42-year sentence, which was at the time the longest prison sentence for in Britain for somebody who committed espionage. He happened to not go to as fancy schools as the other members of the Cambridge Five, so some believe that might have been a factor that he was always a bit of an outsider.
Right.
So he received this hefty prison sentence, but didn't stop him. He only was in prison for a few short years, and then he sprung out of prison with the help of some friends, managed to defect and get over to the Soviet Union, where he lived out the rest of his days and into old age. And interesting with him, and it's not certainly not him only, but those who get so far down into the espionage game, they will tend to downplay the consequences of what they did. So they'll sort of preach about how they had these ideological convictions and their conscience compelled them to act in certain ways. But when they asked about the actual consequences for individuals who were compromised by them, they sort of downplay it and say, oh, well, nobody died because of what I did. But in reality,
Right.
agents were compromised, they were rounded up, and generally they found themselves at the bottom of a basement with a bullet in the brain. And that, I think, was the difference between East and West in the Cold War, is that in the West, if you were caught spying, there were some executions, but generally speaking, the worst you were in for was a long prison sentence, which is not great, of course. Nobody wants that. But if you were outed as a enemy informant or a spy in the Soviet Union, that was the end of you. You pretty much got executed. So there were different repercussions for doing your spying work depending on which side of the Iron Curtain you found yourselves in.
Different approaches.
Yeah, different approaches. Some, could argue for both, I suppose.
And that almost makes the C in the mice all the more interesting, because this seems to be the one where they have the least say in it. So this is when a person is being manipulated. They're not sort of choosing by their free will to become a spy.
There's the word compromat.
Yes, coercion and
has been thrown around in sort of like the public discourse over the last couple of years. So even in the U.S. So I think this was the one I was most familiar with.
Okay.
The idea of this concept. Yeah.
So the C, coercion or compromise, you don't want to have your spy if you're trying to recruit a spy for your cause. I mean, the worst possible spy to have is one who doesn't want to be your spy, because they can very quickly turn on you. But yes, of course. So blackmail, the classic honey trap, exploiting individual vulnerabilities or having dirt on somebody is a classic way of how spies have been recruited in the past. This would, generally speaking, be things like financial crimes, doing a little bit of dodgy dealing on the side. There's examples of people who've been forced into espionage because they were selling a few things on the black market, and the person on the other side of the person who was trying to recruit them knew that, and they didn't want their bosses to find that out. There's, of course, other embarrassing secrets. Sex has always been a good way to recruit spies. That's the honey trap, where somebody's lured into a sexual encounter, which is then photographed or videoed, and that's then used as blackmail to compel the person to provide secret information.
Yeah, I've actually heard, I forget where I read about this, but the idea of that homosexuality was a problem within the national security apparatus was not because there's any inherently thing wrong with a person being homosexual. It was that they were keeping a secret. And
that was one of our other episodes.
Yeah, it was one of our. It was in. I wasn't sure if it was in the Lavender Scare episode.
Yes,
I think that it was, right?
Yeah, it was. Yes,
that this person is hiding something that, if found out, they could be exploited.
Right.
In some form or fashion was the worry.
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, sexual impropriety sexual behavior, as deemed by society in a particular given time, would be a huge determining factor as to how bad this particular scenario was. So yes, in the any time before, I suppose 30, 40 years ago,
Right.
A blackmail of a homosexual encounter for somebody who was living that aspect secretly would have been far worse than if it was the usual run-of-the-mill affair with a secretary. I mean, that could certainly ruin a person's life, and is not good at all. But yeah, certainly homosexuality was much more of a damning thing for people.
Something that you would want to keep secret.
Yes. Yeah. And and there's an example of such a person, John Vassell. He was a British civil servant working at the embassy, and he ended up spying for the Soviet Union during the Cold War. He was ultimately arrested in early 1962, and he had been identified by the KGB for recruitment, given that he had access to information at the British embassy that the Soviets wanted to get their hands on. He was then lured into a homosexual encounter, and photographs were taken. Obviously, he was not aware of that, and then these were used to coerce him to become a spy. Horrible situation for him, no doubt. I don't think he's perfectly innocent. I mean, he did receive money, so he kind of ultimately turned that around so that he could benefit in some way. So again, interplay with a whole bunch of different motivating factors. But somebody like him, if that situation hadn't arisen, probably would never have become a spy. And the one why generally people look at that factor as being not the best way to recruit somebody as your agent in place. So if somebody's ideologically convicted about some issue, they are, and as you say, Isaac, they decided, well, I'm going to die on this hill if I must, and they are really committed to that cause. Whereas somebody who's being coerced, they don't want to be a spy necessarily. They're only doing it to try and protect themselves. It's a self-preservation thing. And there's the propensity for that recruit to then turn on their handler, because they start to view their handler as their tormentor. And at some point they might suddenly think, well, actually, I can't take this anymore. It's actually worse. My psychological condition is worse having to play this espionage game than the truth just coming out. And so then they can blow up the whole operation, or they could confess to whoever it is that they work for, if it's an intelligence agency or an embassy or whatever, and then be turned as a double agent and start feeding false information back to the handler. And so there's also
that's such a hard thing for a handler to know. Like, where is this person? Like, like how far can I push this person before they're gonna break? Right? Like if they're being coerced. That's like an impossible thing to
exactly. So it might be a case of having to continue to get new information on that person, or new dirt to try and keep them in line, or it could be threats against their family. There's all sorts of ways it can be done, I suppose. But still, it doesn't make for a good spy.
This is a little bit outside of the scope of the conversation, although I'm kind of curious, since you live in the UK, is the fear of something like that, like, explain some of the treatment of someone like Alan Turing, someone who was in a position of sort of like intelligence and during the war, and then outed as a homosexual, and then sort of treated. Is that kind of like that rationale? Like, we can't have these folks having been in this space. Just out of curiosity, because I don't know. I know a little bit about Turing, but mostly from like the movies.
Yeah, I've not. I mean, I'm in the same position as you, so I've not covered his story. Although of course, the Enigma machines and cracking the codes during World War II, very well known story. And what happened to Turing after that, of course, a whole story in its own right. But yeah, I guess, I mean, if somebody had known that aspect of his life and had access to him, it could very well have been used as leverage to get him to jump ship. But I guess it's just speculation, and you don't know what's going on inside the mind of a person. And it comes back to the slammer study that I discussed in the beginning, and sort of recognizing that there are oftentimes that people are very easily, if somebody's very easily influenced, the coercion or compromise can be something that they're more susceptible to as a recruitment strategy. Another example of a spy from history who was initially coerced but then kind of bought into the spying role was Alexander Ogorodnik, and he was stationed in Colombia, and he was recruited in 1973, and the local CIA had identified him for recruitment because they knew that he had a Colombian mistress. He got her pregnant, and he'd also built up a whole bunch of debts. I don't recall how he got these debts, but he found himself not able to pay for his living expenses, and he ended up taking an embassy vehicle and selling it to try and recover some costs. And the CIA somehow became aware of that information, and I think he was approached initially at a spa or a bathhouse of some sort, and was ultimately recruited on the basis that you better play along or your superiors are going to find out about this. And he became a spy. He was then transferred to the US, and he was an effective spy, but the operation was ultimately compromised. I don't recall specifically who compromised that particular operation, but sadly for him, it ended up with him biting down on a cyanide capsule. Don't know if you can say the S word if this is going to be on YouTube. But he was given a pen that had a capsule in it that if he found himself in a sticky situation, he could bite down on. And that's what happened. He was arrested by the KGB, and during an interrogation, he said, "Okay, fine, chaps, I'll confess. Just bring me a piece of paper, and I'll write my confession for you." And either he had his pen on him, or he asked specifically to be brought his pen. And as soon as he did that, he took his life. So very sad story from start to finish with Ogorodnik. But an example of someone who was coerced into the game. Probably wouldn't have got involved if he hadn't been forced, but then willingly sort of participated, and ended very sadly for him.
Yeah.
So I know we have one more. We're going to get to the E in mice. But what I'm interested in, just listening to all of your examples, which are fascinating, did you find any women spies? And was this something that started at a specific time or a specific era that women started to be recruited as spies? Because, I mean, overwhelmingly, of course, they're men, but is that an object of the era in which you're looking at, or something else?
I would say a bit of that, objects of the era. I've covered quite a few female spies or secret agents
Yes.
on my channel. I mean, I think the earliest one that I can think of is Matahari, that I've covered on my channel, and she was sort of given this erroneous persona of being the sort of original femme fatale type figure, and she just used her social status and her sexuality, and she was an exotic dancer and a very famous, well-known person, moved in the highest social circles, and the extent to which she actually was spying is a little bit in question. I think she just got in far in over her head when she didn't need to, and she was manipulative, and she had multiple men sort of funding the luxurious lifestyle that she enjoyed, and that sort of thing. But I mean, she's one of and she was ultimately faced the firing squad for her role, whereas others involved in that ordeal sort of escaped a similar fate, which I think is telling. And then moving beyond that into World War II, you had excuse me, you had many female officers working for the SOE, that's the Special Operations Executive, which were a group organization founded by Winston Churchill with the specific aim of conducting clandestine operations in France and supporting the resistance networks there. So you had people like among the D-Day spies, Lily Sergiu, who I've covered on the channel. You had, just the names are now escaping me, but various other women in the Special Operations Executive who were put their lives on the line just as much as anybody else, and some of them paid the ultimate price for that. And people like Virginia Hall, who was based in France, and the thumbnail that I've got for that video when I covered her story about a year and a half ago is a Queen of the Resistance, and she was really seen as a leadership figure among the German resistance networks, and perhaps playing a slightly different role. I mean, in that context, it was not so much spying as it was leading a resistance movement, and managing an underground network, connecting the right people to each other, and she had to live a life of a spy in the sense that it was all secretive. She was living within, sort of behind enemy lines, in Vichy France during World War II, and so in many senses performed the same role as a spy. It wasn't necessarily information that she was trading, but she was smuggling people out of the country, helping soldiers or pilots who had been shot down to get back to Britain, etc. Same for Nancy Wake, another key figure of that era. So, yeah, I think there's, I think as we move forward in time, there will no doubt be more female spies.
Right.
There are a number among the US spies in 1985, the year of the spy. There's a few among their number. So I think naturally, as there are more women who are having more senior positions, better access to information, it's certainly going to equalize at some point. But
and it would be interesting to do sort of a slammer study in the future, and to see if any of those things change.
Yeah.
When you have men and women spies being looked at.
Yes, and see who's more treacherous.
Yeah.
By default. Battle of the sexes.
Yeah. So, I want to make sure that we get to the E in M.I.C.E,
Yes.
which I think is a fascinating idea that, in and of itself, the ego being a driving factor here.
Yeah, and this one I think is probably one of the elements in M.I.C.E that always plays a role to some degree or another. And so the ego is about having a sense of intellectual superiority. It's often in conjunction with other motivating factors, and we've seen a sort of psychological profile being built around this factor, which is a belief that somebody's talents are not being properly utilized in their job, that they're being passed over for promotion. What I said earlier, they may feel that they're the smartest person in the room, and they're not being given that recognition. And they decide, well, perhaps the best way I can show all these people how smart I am and that I'm actually the one in control. So it's about control as well, of course, is to go and spy. And notable example being Robert Hansen, described by the FBI as the worst intelligence disaster in their history. And
Ouch.
yeah, he had a sort of James Bond complex. I think he owned the same firearm that James Bond did in the films. And he just had a narcissistic streak, and was fueled by ego to prove to everyone around him that he was actually in control. And it's a little bit odd way to live out that fantasy, because it's done in secret and you don't want it to be exposed. But I think the satisfaction that somebody like Robert Hansen gained was doing this without people knowing. And so he felt a sense of control in the fact that other people didn't know what he was doing, and that he was pulling all the strings and they were dancing to the tune that he was playing. And I mean, he received a lot of money for what he did. So, of course, money was a factor there. He spied for 2 decades over, I think, 3 periods. His wife, when his wife initially found out about it, and she compelled him to go to church and ask for forgiveness of his sins, confess to the priest, and didn't stop him though. In the story that I've covered, interestingly, he was told to give his ill-gotten gains to Mother Teresa or one of her organizations. Whether he did that or not, I don't know. But he didn't go and fess up to what he'd done. He stayed clean for a little while, but then went straight back into it, into 2 different periods. And he was ultimately arrested in 2001. But a prime example of somebody who was absolutely fueled by egotistical dreams and desires, and feeling like he was the smartest guy in the room. He had a pager back in the pager days before cell phones, that he had encrypted himself apparently, and he was convinced that this was like the best encryption ever. But lo and behold, when he was being investigated and the FBI managed to separate him from his pager by proposing that they have a shooting contest in the FBI's gun range in the basement, they got it to the IT team, which cracked the encryption in no time at all and managed to get all the incriminating evidence off it. So, yeah, he obviously clearly was not the smartest guy in the room, but always believed he was. And then I suppose, I don't know if this is controversial or not, depends on how you feel about Edward Snowden. And I think, I feel it's safe to say that he was motivated in part by ego for what he did. Others will say, well, it was purely out of maybe, if not ideologically driven, certainly a conscience thing. And
I think by virtue of the fact that he does public interviews to this day, I think he likes. There is definitely some ego there.
Likes the attention. Wants,
for sure. And he had a similar sort of situation. So he, as many will know, he was an NSA contractor and CIA employee, or contracted to the CIA. And he had these purported noble convictions of exposing the way that US intelligence and technology and communications companies were spying on everybody and exposing that sort of thing. But again, it was a lot of the assessment of his motivations were around the fact that he felt underappreciated, that he should have been in a more senior role, that he wasn't being taken seriously. So that's certainly something that would have been playing on his mind, as much as he will tout internet freedom as the prime motivation for him.
Yeah, and it's actually, he's an interesting person to bring up in terms of something you mentioned early in the episode, where they, people who do this often downplay the consequences of their actions. I know some folks that work in defense. So what the specifics of what they do and what they know, I don't know. But they have, with 100% of them to a T, have emotional responses to Edward Snowden. Like vehement emotional responses to Edward Snowden in a way that doesn't make sense to me. Not knowing probably what they understand about what was compromised and how it was compromised, in terms of like the human impact, like on the ground. Right? Like the idea that he put people in danger,
exactly,
makes them very emotional. So and then we don't really know what happened based on the consequences of what is, like, I guess, because it's not public, most likely, or it won't be for many decades if it ever comes out. But he obviously doesn't necessarily have that for that framework. He talks about it being about net freedom and spying, which is all fair. Like that's a place to argue about whether the government should be doing that. But yeah, I just want to point out that it is an interesting place where I actually have had an interaction with someone who, in theory, may have more understanding about the impact of how something happened, and there's a little bit of downplaying that goes out
Yeah,
Right.
it's fascinating. I mean, I don't have any insider knowledge about that. I just make videos for YouTube, but just
Yeah.
observing it and you said about the sort of adverse reactions that people within that community, the intelligence community, would have. I completely understand that, and it goes back to perhaps he discovered something that was not good in terms of the internet freedom and the spying. The NSA perhaps crossed a line, but there are ways and means of doing things. And
Yeah. It's about how it all came out and
yes,
what was leaked also
yeah,
with it.
yeah, going
Right.
to Hong Kong and having a expose in the press with the media. I think there's more to it than that. So I certainly have no sympathy
It,
for the man.
what they described, just to be so I can provide a little bit more clarification, was the idea that there is enough information. It's hard to tell when you're not involved in it to know what will compromise sources and methods.
Yeah.
So whether if you can read through the Snowden files and everything that he leaked, and from an outsider's point of view, not glean any information from it necessarily, but someone who is involved in on the ground espionage may be able to tell, like, oh, this person is a spy because of those things,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
But it may look like nothing to us.
Yeah.
That's sort of the idea, is that he put a lot of people's lives in danger.
Absolutely. I mean, I've no doubt the reams of computer files that he took. I mean, there must have been trails to specific individuals that could be identified. Well, I can only speculate, but there must have been agents in place in Russia that were compromised because of him. And like anybody else, Snowden needs to still sleep at night, so he's going to try and compartmentalize that aspect of it, and maybe look at it from a utilitarian point of view and say, well, what was that just collateral damage? Was that worth the cost? What I did for the internet freedom and for the American people, etc. He's going to have to justify it in one way or another. I think it would just be fascinating if he came back to the US and stood trial. That would be something to watch.
Be interesting.
Yeah.
That would definitely be something for the a 2-3 generations later, when some other people are doing a version of this podcast 60 years from now, would be able to discuss in the history books. That's
absolutely
for sure. So I guess the last thought that you sent over in your notes was the idea that M.I.C.E has evolved. The idea that framework is a little bit different these days than it has been.
Yes. Yeah. So M.I.C.E as a framework was devised in the late 70s when there was a Soviet defector, Stanislaw Levchenko, and he was a KGB major. And when he defected, that he kind of came up with this whole idea of M.I.C.E. And I still think that it has stood the test of time and is really functional as a way to understand the fundamental reasons why people turn to spying, together with the findings from the Slammer study. But then the concept has been taken further. There's another acronym called RASCLS, RASCLS, and that, in my view, it's fascinating and interesting, and it would be a topic for a whole other conversation. But it really is just a way of taking that M.I.C.E cake and cutting it into thinner slices. You can probably put the slices from that RASCLS framework within M.I.C.E, and it fits somewhere around in there. And just for the benefit of listeners, RASCLS stands for reciprocation, authority, scarcity, commitment or consistency, liking, and social proof. So it's quite a bit more complicated, and exactly what those things mean in terms of the motivations is not immediately obvious just from the words, as the M.I.C.E framework is. So I like to stick to M.I.C.E just because it's easier to remember, for one thing, and to understand the fundamental drivers that compel people to dive headfirst into this world.
Because you said that you can sort of put those pieces back together into M.I.C.E, not to be disparaging towards consultants, but like it sounds like it's almost like someone hired McKinsey to like, hey, come up with something, and they because these words on their face don't mean anything to me
Yeah.
at
Let's
all. So it's like,
unnecessarily
it
complicate
feels like
something that makes
jargony
sense.
for
Yeah.
jargon's sake a little bit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Again, as you said,
it can
I'm
be.
literally judging this from the 3 sentences you sent over, and
Right.
not from my understanding
It
of what
just
it actually
doesn't
is. So I'm
seem.
sure it's not that, but that's sort of what it seemed like.
Yeah, no, the notes I sent and our conversation right now are certainly not going to do it justice. I think it's a legitimate way of looking at it. But just for example, so things like scarcity, that's just dividing the question of money. So it's saying, well, there's something that this person wants that I can give them, and I'll give that thing to you, whether it's money or something else, if you
Oh, okay.
if you
Okay.
become a spy for me. And reciprocation and authority. Reciprocation is I guess maybe I'm looking at it too simplistically, but it's simply I do something for you, you do something for me in return. Authority, that could be couched into the ego and the coercion category. So yeah, they kind of can be all linked together, I suppose. If you did a case study of a spy and went mice and rascals, you could probably link the things to the same words in each acronym. But it's just another way of different framework that goes a little bit deeper. Perhaps mice can be a little bit generalized, but I think generalizations are often there for a reason, because they do apply generally to all these situations.
Yeah.
Wow, all of this has been super, super cool conversation. Before you, now we're coming up to our hour, and before you go, I did have a couple of questions. Since you've been steeped in, and they're a little bit more of your opinion stuff as opposed to like the history things.
Sure.
Since you've been steeped in this stuff for the last couple of years, do you like spy movies or television shows more or less than when you started?
That's a good question.
I think I like them the same.
The same, okay.
Because I think the spy movies are so far removed from the reality that I can still find enjoyment of that. So by profession, I'm a lawyer, but I can still enjoy Suits or Boston Legal, which was my favorite, because it's so ridiculous and so removed from the reality of how things actually happened. It's you can still get the entertainment value is still there.
Right.
But it has made me realize that covering some of these stories, I mean, a lot of interesting things happen, but it's not a James Bond thriller from start to finish. It's in many cases, I'm thinking of somebody like Jonathan Pollard, also arrested in 1985, I believe, in the year of the spy. And he was passing on classified information to Israel. And I mean, his story was pretty boring, actually. I mean, he just sat at his desk and he opened his filing cabinet and took documents and put it in his briefcase and went over to a house owned by the Israelis and photocopied the documents and went back to his job. So it's like,
so
well,
mundane.
yeah, it's
No one's
so
watching
mundane.
that movie.
Yeah, well, but then the interesting parts of it are like the impact. So it's something so mundane can lead to such global consequences, like a butterfly effect type situation, where a piece of paper with some information about the location of an Iranian nuclear site, then he passes that on to Israel, a US ally, and they now have information that the US didn't necessarily want to share with Israel for whatever reason, and that Israel then acts on it. So you just see how the consequences of these
A
mundane.
couple years later, a thumb drive gets put into a computer, and
Exactly.
a centrifuge explodes, and no one knows what's going on.
Yeah. So I have a lot of time for watching spy dramas, etc., and
Cool.
things like The Americans, where they
I was
pull.
going to ask. I love that show. It was one of my favorites of the last, recent. I guess it's not really recent, but I thought it was very good.
Decade or so, and then so interesting because they pull aspects from all these different stories, and I'll see quite often there'll be people commenting on a video that I've done, and they say, "Oh, this sounds like it was from this episode of The Americans," and they've essentially taken little bits and pieces of all the different stories, no doubt all the best, most juicy parts, and sort of made their the TV show. So it's fascinating to see that sort of real world events and occurrences being weaved into the entertainment.
And Lynn, I'll leave it to you to ask a final question. But I'm curious to know if there was anything in learning, like sort of this framework of mice and how people manipulate other folks. Obviously, this is a very formal structure that people did that might be beneficial for people to understand in their personal lives. Like even just understanding like how you may be, like what are your weak points and sort of. I was looking at this and being like, oh, how would someone approach me? When I was thinking, like, am I, or any of these things factors in my life that
Mm-hmm.
would necessarily like that I could be compromised, but even on like an interpersonal level, I'm just
Yeah, well,
on a
I think MICE is a framework not only for spying, it's for in any situation where one person is wanting to get somebody to do something else, or
Mm-hmm.
and not only to say it's about coercion, but in any kind of interpersonal relationship, if you are unfortunate enough to be in some sort of manipulative relationship or an abusive relationship, I'm pretty sure you could see all four of these MICE aspects coming to the fore just on a day-to-day basis. So I think it's an exercise in understanding psychology, understanding the human mind, and what makes the human mind tick. So we traditionally look at it in the context of espionage, but just in terms of day-to-day relationships where there's nothing more at stake beyond that personal relationship, I think it's certainly useful to understand. So there's a few lessons you can take from it, I reckon.
Absolutely. Well, for our final question, I'm going to steal what is usually Isaac's question, and that is that in all of our episodes, we like to conclude talking about how I think it's within an hour of where you live, there is a cool historic site that you either don't know about or you haven't visited. So we always like to ask our guests where people could go and learn more about spying. Now, I have been to the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., so I don't know if you've been there and what you think of it. But where would you send people if they said, oh my gosh, I'm fascinated with spies and I want to go somewhere. I want to go somewhere and I want to see more about them. I want to learn more about them. Where should they visit?
Well, within an hour of where I am, which is near Bath in the southwest of England. So I'm about just less than 2 hour train ride from London.
Everything in the UK is within an hour.
Yeah, that's kind of nice.
Yeah. So if you were in London, I could. There would be reams of different places that you could go. Not necessarily spy related, but I think that the Churchill war rooms are fascinating, where you can go and have a look at where Winston Churchill and his cabinet and other leaders worked during the Second World War, plotting and planning.
Ooh, yeah.
But a really interesting place that's local to me, and it's just the next suburb up the road. I've never been there because it's not a tourist attraction. And I think that's what creates some of the intrigue and why I want to go there, which it's called the Burlington Bunker. And where I live is a lot of the neighborhoods, there's a huge military presence, military bases. And the Ministry of Defense, this Burlington Bunker was used, or it was built, wasn't ever used, after the Second World War, and was intended to be used as the bunker where the royal family and the British government could flee in the event of the breakout of nuclear war. And it's since been decommissioned. It's a massive complex. There's a really interesting article. It's a website called the Urban Explorer, which they went into this bunker. It's been decommissioned. As I say, it's not a tourist attraction, but it's almost like a ghost town. So people, they just sort of upped and left, and the cafeteria has still got all the knives and forks and the plates sitting on these old tables. So it's probably a bit spooky, but again, not specifically a spy attraction, but just thinking of the consequences of spying and a fascinating piece of history. So I want to go there sometime. I don't know. I'll knock on the door if anybody lets me in. Probably not, but the Burlington Bunker is within an hour of me.
Yeah, I don't know if you would want someone to answer the door if you're not going to.
No.
It's supposed to not be occupied currently.
Yeah.
Well, this was awesome. I know you mentioned before we started talking, before we started recording, that our typical guests are academics, and that you're not an academic. You could do this YouTube spy stuff as a passion project for you.
Yeah.
But genuinely, you're doing fantastic history, and you're doing one of the best parts of it is bringing it to the people in a way that they can connect with it and engage with it. So I really appreciate you, one, doing the work that you're doing, and two, taking the time to talk with us today.
Oh, well, thank you, Isaac.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Lynn. It's been an absolute privilege. First time appearing on a podcast, so I'm very
How
pleased to
exciting is
have done
that?
it.
Oh,
Well,
that's
and
great.
we'll make sure we put the link to your podcast, to your YouTube channel in our show notes. So all people have to do is just go ahead, scan down, click on it, and watch all of the videos. Just keep
Brilliant.
yourself entertained for hours and hours.
Yeah, it'll be in the show notes, and then also if you search Philip Thompson on YouTube, it will probably pop up.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah. If you add True Life Spy Stories, it should definitely pop up first.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as always, this conversation was brought to you with support of our members over on Patreon. So if you'd like more of this content, go over to patreon.com/primary source media to go check out what we have on our paid tiers. But if you're a free member, you can get access to our Discord, where you can have conversations and ask questions to me and Lynn and some of the historians and folks that we've interviewed. So be sure to check that out.
Yeah.
Thanks again, Philip, for being here.
Thank you so much.
Cheerio.